I have no wish to constantly travel, but my life is such now that I can reap the benefits of what I've done and also continue to do my radio shows.
At 78, Elton John stands as one of music's greatest legends, a man whose voice, piano, and glittering stage presence shaped generations. Yet behind the dazzling concerts, timeless songs, and decades of fame lies a story far more fragile than fans ever imagined. Whispers about his health, emotional battles, and the high cost of a lifetime in the spotlight are now surfacing with heartbreaking clarity. As the curtain slowly falls on an extraordinary career, questions grow louder. What exactly was happening to the beloved star? And how did things become so heartbreaking now, after all these extraordinary years in music history? Elton John's tragic losses. In July 1990, the world lost a brave young man named Ryan White. He was only 18 years old when he passed away from complications caused by AIDS. Ryan had been born with hemophilia, a condition that affects the blood's ability to clot. Because of this illness, he needed regular blood treatments. Sadly, one of those treatments was contaminated, and through it, he contracted HIV, the virus that leads to AIDS. Ryan's life quickly became a national story, but not for the reasons anyone would have wished. When his school discovered that he had HIV, officials tried to stop him from attending classes. At the time, fear and misunderstanding about the disease were everywhere. Many people wrongly believed they could catch HIV simply by being near someone who had it. The reaction from some adults in his community was shocking and painful. Parents removed their children from school because they did not want them near Ryan. Neighbors treated his family with hostility. Some even slashed the tires of their car. Strangers went so far as to send hateful letters and death threats to a teenage boy who was already fighting a serious illness. It was a heartbreaking example of how cruel people can become when fear replaces compassion. During the last years of Ryan's life, the legendary musician Elton John formed a friendship with him. This was not a publicity stunt or a moment for cameras. Their relationship was sincere and deeply personal. Elton truly cared about Ryan and wanted to support him during a difficult time. He often called Ryan on the phone just to talk. He visited him at home and spent time with him like a caring older friend. When Ryan's illness became worse, Elton stayed close, offering comfort and kindness. He saw something special in the young man, an innocence and bravery that reflected how unfair the world could sometimes be. When Ryan passed away, the loss hit Elton very hard. Standing at the funeral, he looked at the life of a boy who had suffered not only from illness, but also from hatred and ignorance. The moment left a deep mark on him. The grief he felt was powerful, the kind of sorrow that changes a person from the inside. But Ryan's death was only the beginning of a painful period in Elton's life. Throughout the late 1980s and into the entire 1990s, the AIDS epidemic was spreading quickly, especially within creative communities. Many of Elton's friends were artists, designers, musicians, dancers, and writers. These were people he had shared laughter with, people he had spent long nights talking to about music, life, and dreams. One by one, many of them began to disappear. The disease moved through their world with a cruelty that is difficult to understand unless you lived through those years. Elton watched as more and more friends became sick and eventually passed away. Each loss felt like another piece of his world breaking away. He later spoke about how frequent the funerals became. There were periods when he attended one almost every week. Every 7 days brought another goodbye. Another familiar face was gone. Another seat at the dinner table remained empty forever. Then, another devastating tragedy arrived. In July 1997, The famous fashion designer Gianni Versace was murdered outside his mansion in Miami Beach. The killing shocked the world. There was no warning and no clear reason that made sense to those who knew him. Elton and Versace were very close friends. Their friendship was comfortable and genuine. They did not need to impress each other or put on any kind of show. They could simply sit together, talk, laugh, and be themselves. Versace's sudden and violent death left Elton heartbroken. It created a deep emptiness in his life, a wound that felt impossible to heal. And then, only 2 months later, tragedy struck again. Princess Diana passed away in a car crash in Paris. Diana and Elton had shared one of the most genuine friendships in public life. Like many close relationships, theirs had moments of tension. At one point, they argued and briefly drifted apart. But shortly before her death, they had made peace and repaired their friendship. That reconciliation, filled with forgiveness and warmth, made the loss even more painful when she was suddenly gone. How was their relationship? Did he bid her farewell? Let's find out. Elton John's breathtaking tribute to Diana. When Princess Diana passed away in a tragic car crash inside a tunnel in Paris on August 31st, 1997, the whole world was left in shock and deep sadness. Millions of people mourned the loss of the beloved princess, who had touched so many lives with her kindness and compassion. During that heartbreaking time, one person who felt the loss very deeply was her close friend, the famous musician Elton John. When preparations began for Diana's funeral at Westminster Abbey in London, Elton John was asked to perform in front of a global audience. It was not an easy request. Singing at such an emotional moment while grieving the loss of a dear friend required incredible courage. To honor Diana, Elton decided to change the lyrics of his well-known song, "Candle in the Wind." The song had originally been written about Marilyn Monroe, but Elton carefully rewrote the words so that they would reflect Diana's life, her compassion, and the love people felt for her. On the day of the funeral, Elton walked slowly to the piano inside the historic Abbey. The atmosphere was heavy with grief. World leaders, members of the royal family, and grieving friends sat in silence. Beyond the walls of the church, millions of people gathered in the streets, while billions more watched the ceremony on television across the globe. When Elton sat down at the piano, his hands were shaking slightly. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. His voice sounded fragile, yet deeply sincere as he began to sing. The performance was not perfect in a technical sense, but that did not matter. What people saw and heard was raw emotion. It was the sound of a man mourning someone he cared about deeply. An estimated 2 billion people around the world watched that performance. For many viewers, it became one of the most emotional moments ever seen on live television. Elton's tribute captured the sadness felt by millions who had admired Diana's kindness and humanity. After the funeral, the special version of "Candle in the Wind" was released as a single. The response from the public was enormous. People everywhere wanted to own the song as a way to remember Diana and honor her legacy. The single went on to become the best-selling single in music history, with more than 33 million copies sold worldwide. Yet, despite the incredible success of the record, Elton John chose not to keep any of the money it made. Every single penny earned from the song was donated to charity through the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. For Elton, the song was never about profit. It was about remembering a friend and helping continue the charitable work that Diana had cared about so deeply. But even though Elton gave away all the money, the pain of losing Diana could not simply disappear. Grief does not work like money that can be donated or spent. Instead, it stays inside a person. Over time, it grows heavier and settles deep in the heart. As the years passed, Elton's body also began to show the effects of the long and difficult life he had lived. At one point, he faced a frightening health scare when doctors suspected prostate cancer, forcing him to think seriously about his own mortality. Later, while touring in South America, he developed a dangerous infection that became so severe he had to be rushed into intensive care. It was a life-threatening moment that reminded him how fragile life can be. In addition to these struggles, Elton had to undergo several surgeries on his hip and knee. These operations slowly reduced his ability to move freely on stage, something that had once been a huge part of his energetic performances. Then, in 2023, another health challenge appeared. Elton suffered a serious eye infection that left him with limited vision in one eye. For a man who had spent his entire life bringing color, creativity, and music into the world, losing part of his ability to see that world was a painful and deeply ironic struggle. But how was his childhood? Did he have it smoothly? Let's take a closer look. Elton John's childhood wounds. Elton John was born as Reginald Kenneth Dwight on March 25, 1947, in the quiet suburb of Pinner in Middlesex, just northwest of London. From the very beginning of his life, his childhood was far from happy. In fact, many people who later learned about his early years say that he often felt unwanted in his own home. His father, Stanley Dwight, served as a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force. He was known as a strict and emotionally distant man. Stanley liked order and discipline, and he seemed to believe that having a child had disturbed the careful life he had planned for himself. Because of this, he rarely showed affection to his son. He didn't hug him, play with him, or encourage him. Even simple things, like hearing a child laugh or cry, seemed to irritate him. For young Reggie, the house never felt like a place of warmth and safety. Instead of feeling loved and protected, he slowly began to feel that his presence was a problem, as if he was a burden to his own father. It was a painful lesson for a small child to learn before he was even old enough to explain his feelings. His mother, Sheila Dwight, was very different from his father. At times, she could be loving and cheerful. She would make her son feel important and special. But her moods could change suddenly. One moment she might treat him like the most important person in the world, and the next moment she might speak sharply or act as if he had caused trouble. Because of this, life at home often felt confusing and unstable. The atmosphere in the house was tense. Arguments between his parents were common, and the home often felt like a battlefield filled with silence, anger, and emotional explosions. Little Reggie sometimes sat quietly at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, listening as his parents argued loudly downstairs. He would cover his ears and wonder what he had done wrong, even though none of it was his fault. But in the middle of this difficult childhood, something remarkable happened. One day, when Reggie was only 3 years old, he heard music playing somewhere in the house. The sound caught his attention immediately. Drawn by curiosity, he walked to the piano and climbed onto the bench. Although he was only a toddler who couldn't read or even dress himself properly. Yet, something incredible happened. He began to play the tune he had just heard, finding the notes by ear. His tiny fingers moved across the keys as if they already knew where to go. It was clear that he had a natural gift. The first person to truly notice this talent was his grandmother. She saw something special in the quiet, sensitive boy and encouraged him to take piano lessons. More importantly, she made him feel valued and loved. In many ways, she became the person who gave him the support he was missing from his parents. Still, music could not completely protect him from the problems in his family. When Reggie was 14 years old, his parents' troubled marriage finally ended. His father packed his belongings and left the family home. Later, Stanley started a new life and had more children. The painful truth that Reggie eventually realized was that his father behaved very differently with them. He was warm, affectionate, and involved in their lives, everything he had never been with his first son. For Reggie, this discovery was deeply heartbreaking. All he ever wanted, he once said, was for his father to hug him and say that he was proud of him. Sadly, that moment never came. Stanley Dwight passed away in 1991, and those words were never spoken. How did he rise to stardom? What challenges did he face? Let's take a closer look. Elton John's rise and hidden struggles. By 1970, Elton John had exploded onto the world stage like a blazing supernova. His August performance at the Troubadour in Los Angeles didn't just make waves, it sent shockwaves through the entire music industry. People still talk about it as one of the most extraordinary debut shows in rock history. He had walked into that small, smoky club as an unknown, an unassuming musician with a piano and a dream. He walked out as a figure everyone instantly knew would become legendary. Every music journalist scribbling furiously in notebooks, every record executive leaning forward with wide eyes, every single person in that room who had a voice or a decision to make. They all understood, in that electric moment, that they had witnessed something almost miraculous, something that happens once, maybe twice, in a generation. Between 1970 and 1976, Elton released new albums at a dizzying pace, roughly every 6 months. But these weren't just albums. They were masterpieces. Honky Chateau, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Captain Fantastic, and The Brown Dirt Cowboy. Each record a dazzling, fully formed world of sound. His partner in all this, Bernie Taupin, was not just a lyricist, but a lifelong collaborator, a mind perfectly attuned to Elton's musical imagination. Together, they produced music at a speed and a quality that seemed almost superhuman. Stadiums filled effortlessly. Money poured in faster than anyone could count it. He owned a private jet, a football club, sprawling mansions with rooms he hadn't even explored yet. By every measure, he was one of the most successful people alive. And yet, beneath all that glittering success, he was quietly dying. The substances started innocently enough. Illicit stimulants, a casual indulgence of the 1970s. But Elton didn't have the faculty of moderation. Moderation requires knowing when to stop, knowing when you have enough, and Elton had never felt enough in his life. So he poured the substance into the emptiness left by a distant, emotionally absent father. When the substance couldn't quiet the void, he added alcohol. When that wasn't enough, he turned to food, shopping, more substances, more alcohol, an endless spiral of frantic, desperate attempts to fill a hole that had no bottom. At his worst, he spent $15,000 to $20,000 a week on the substance alone. He would lock himself in hotel rooms for days, closing the curtains, shutting the world out, and consume until his nose bled, until his heart thudded so violently against his ribs, he was sure he would die. And yet, each night, after calling someone in tears, swearing it was the last time, he would start again. He later described those years as a kind of living death, his body performing on stage, his hands striking the right notes, his voice hitting the right words, while the real Elton, whoever he truly was, had checked out completely. He was a ghost, performing inside his own life. On top of everything was the crushing weight of hiding who he really was. This was the 1970s and 80s. Being openly gay in the public eye wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. A career-ending decision, social exile, the potential destruction of everything he had worked for. so he buried himself in a lie. In 1984, he married Renate Blauel, a talented and kind recording engineer. It was a genuine attempt to be something he was not. The marriage lasted 3 years. He has called it one of his greatest regrets, not because of Renate, whom he still remembers with tenderness, but because the lie stole years from both of them that could never be recovered. Even his voice, the very instrument of his fame, began to betray him. The sound that had once seemed eternal, soaring above stadiums and arenas, was faltering. Behind the glamour, the fame, the gold records, the private jets, there was exhaustion, grief, and a deep, aching loneliness. How was John's road to redemption? Was it the same way like his early days? Let's find out. Elton John's path to recovery. In 1987, Elton John had surgery on his throat. The doctors managed to save his singing voice, but it was never the same again. On July 8, 1990, Elton walked into a treatment center in Chicago. Since that day, he has not touched a drink or a substance. Over 35 years of sobriety. In 1992, he created the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Since then, it has raised more than $600 million to fight HIV and AIDS around the world. Not for publicity, not for tax benefits, but as a lifeline, built from the grief of losing friends one by one. Every clinic, every dollar, every life saved stands as proof of a man turning his suffering into someone else's survival. And then love found him. Not the roar of stadiums or the shallow admiration of fame, but the quiet, steady presence of David Furnish, a Canadian filmmaker who saw the real Elton and stayed. They met in 1993, entered a civil partnership in 2005, married in 2014, and together welcomed 2 sons, Zachary in 2010 and Elijah in 2013. Fatherhood changed everything. The man who spent his life hiding behind sequins and spectacles now had children who needed him simply for who he was, not what he could perform. Suddenly, he was dad, making silly voices at breakfast, reading the same bedtime story night after night, building Lego castles on the living room floor. Through them, he healed the child inside himself, who had never had a proper childhood. In 2023, he retired from touring with his farewell Yellow Brick Road shows. Over 50 years, more than 4,000 performances. On that final night in Stockholm, he played Goodbye Yellow Brick Road with tears streaming down his face. Not sadness, release, a lifetime of waiting, finally laid down. Now, at 78, Elton John lives with limited vision, aching joints, and a heart that has been broken more times than most could bear. So, what do you think about Elton John's heartbreaking tragedy at 78? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.